Pam Bondi walked into that courtroom facing a judge who didn't take her seriously. By the time she was done, his smirk was gone, and so was the defense's confidence. The heavy doors of the Hillsborough County Courthouse creaked open as Pam Bondi stepped inside. She walked with purpose, her heels clicking against the polished marble floor. The air carried the scent of old paper and stale coffee, the familiar atmosphere of countless legal battles fought and won. This case, however, felt different. The stakes were high, and the opposition, an influential corporate giant accused of fraudulent practices, had spared no expense in their defense at the front of the courtroom. Judge Richard Calloway sat perched on his bench, eyes scanning through a thick stack of papers. His expression was unreadable, but Pam caught the slight twitch at the corner of his mouth, a smirk she had seen that look before. Amusement, skepticism, the kind of condescension reserved for attorneys who were either too young or too ambitious for their own good. Pam was neither, but she knew exactly how the judge viewed her. She took her seat at the plaintiff's table, setting down her leather-bound case file across from her. The opposing counsel, Charles Merritt, adjusted his silk tie. He was in his late 50s, the kind of man who had built a career of reputation alone, coasting on courtroom theatrics and old money connections. He barely glanced in her direction before turning his attention to the judge, exuding the air of someone already convinced of his victory. The courtroom door swung open again. The jury filtered in, men and women from different walks of life. Their faces a mixture of curiosity and boredom. Some adjusted their glasses. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Pam made a mental note of them all. She didn't just see faces, she saw people, stories, biases, hopes, doubts. The bailiff stepped forward, his voice steady. "All rise." Judge Calloway cleared his throat as he straightened his robe. "Be seated," he said, his tone casual, almost dismissive. He shuffled his papers again before peering over the top of his glasses. "Miss Bondi, I trust you are ready to proceed." Pam nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." The judge exhaled through his nose, a hint of a chuckle slipping through. "Well, let's hope this doesn't turn into a circus," he muttered under his breath, just loud enough for the courtroom microphone to catch it. A few members of the jury exchanged looks. Charles Moritz smirked. Pam didn't react. She simply opened her case file and pulled out her notes. This wasn't her first time being underestimated in a courtroom, and it certainly wouldn't be the last, but this time it would be different. The judge had no idea what was coming. Pam stood, her voice steady as she addressed the court. "Your Honor, today's case is about more than just legal technicalities. It's about accountability." Judge Calloway held up a hand, cutting her off before she could get another word in. His expression was somewhere between amusement and impatience, as if he'd already decided how this hearing would go. "Miss Bondi, let's not get ahead of ourselves. We're here for a preliminary motion, not a grandstanding performance." A few quiet chuckles rippled through the courtroom. Pam kept her composure across the aisle. Charles Merritt leaned back in his chair, adjusting his cuffs with a smirk. He had been here before, standing beside deep-pocketed corporations, making problems disappear with technical jargon in well-placed favors. He was certain today would be no different. Pam clasped her hands behind her back. "Understood, Your Honor, but the facts speak for themselves. The defendants knowingly misled thousands of people promising services they had no intention of providing." Judge Calloway exhaled sharply, flipping through a file. "That's a strong accusation, Miss Bondi one. I assume you can back up." Pam met his gaze. "I can and I will." The judge arched an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "Well, let's hear from the defense first, shall we?" He turned toward Charles Merritt. Mr. Merritt in lightness. Merritt rose, flashing an easy grin. "Your Honor, this entire case is built on emotion rather than fact. My client, a respected financial institution, has followed all regulatory guidelines. If some individuals felt misled, that is unfortunate but hardly illegal." He paused for effect, then continued, his voice carrying a practiced ease. "What we have here is a classic example of a plaintiff trying to punish a successful company simply because they don't like how business works. There's no fraud, no deception, just a misunderstanding inflated to the level of litigation." Judge Calloway nodded slowly, as if weighing Merritt's words. Then, with a glance at Pam, he let out a small chuckle. "Miss Bondi, Are we really going to waste the court's time over a misunderstanding? The remark was like a slap in the face, but Pam didn't flinch. She let the silence stretch, forcing the courtroom to sit in it. The jury, the clerks, even Merritt, they all watched her waiting. Then, with deliberate calm, she picked up a document from her file. "No misunderstanding, Your Honor," she said, walking toward the judge's bench. "Just evidence." She placed the document in front of him. Judge Calloway adjusted his glasses, eyes scanning the paper. His smirk faded just a little. Pam turned to face the jury. "What Mr. Merritt calls a misunderstanding is actually a pattern, a deliberate, calculated strategy to deceive customers into signing contracts they don't understand, because they were never meant to understand them." She gestured toward another stack of files on her desk. "And I have the proof." The room shifted. The air changed for the first time. Judge Calloway's expression hardened into something else. Not laughter, not amusement, something closer to recognition. But Pam wasn't done yet. Pam didn't move as the silence thickened around her. She let the weight of her last statement settle, giving everyone in the room a moment to absorb what had just happened. The judge, now fully engaged, tapped his fingers on the armrest of his chair for glancing at Charles Merritt. "Mr. Merritt," Judge Calloway said, clearing his throat, "I assume you have an explanation for this." Merritt's confidence faltered for just a fraction of a second, and before he straightened his tie and forced a chuckle, "Your Honor, with all due respect, I failed to see how one document." Pam was already reaching for another. Not just one. She walked back to her table and pulled out a stack of papers, bound neatly, pages covered in highlighted clauses and footnotes. "I have over 50 contracts here, each with nearly identical language, misleading customers into thinking they were signing up for low-risk investments, when in fact they were agreeing to terms that would leave them financially crippled." Merritt opened his mouth to object, but she wasn't done. She flipped to a page in the first document, turned it so the jury could see, and read aloud. "Section 14B states that the company reserves the right to adjust annual fees based on projected market trends." That sounds harmless, doesn't it? Except that in practice, projected market trends are determined internally without oversight, allowing the company to increase rates arbitrarily without notifying the customer until it's too late. She turned the page. "Section 22C, customers who attempt to withdraw funds early are subjected to administrative penalties." That phrase is vague on purpose, but in reality, those penalties exceed the amount of their actual investment, leaving them with nothing. She turned another page. "Section 31A. The company explicitly denies liability for market-driven losses. But what this clause fails to mention is that my client's funds were never invested in the market at all. Instead, they were funneled into high-risk private ventures that benefited executives while leaving customers in the dark." She set the paper down. "This isn't business. This is theft." The room was dead silent for the first time. Judge Calloway no longer looked amused. He leaned forward slightly, hands clasped. Pam met his gaze head-on. "Now, Your Honor, I'm happy to debate the legal definitions of fraud and deceptive practices all day long, but what I can allow is for my clients to be dismissed as people who simply misunderstood what they were signing. The only misunderstanding here is the belief that this company thought it could get away with this forever." Merritt was shifting in his seat now, his face stiff. "Your Honor, I move to dismiss these claims on the basis of." Pam cut in her voice. "Even, Your Honor," before Mr. Merritt continues, "I'd like to submit one more piece of evidence." She walked back to her files and pulled out a single-page print, out a leaked internal memo. She handed it to the bailiff, who passed it up to Judge Calloway. He skimmed the first few lines and his jaw visibly tightened. Pam turned back to the jury. "This document, obtained from a whistleblower, shows that executives within the company knew about these fraudulent practices for over 5 years. It explicitly instructs employees to, and I quote, delay disclosures for as long as legally possible." Pam paused, scanning the jury's expressions: disgust, shock, even anger. She turned to Judge Calloway, her voice unwavering. "Your Honor, this isn't a misunderstanding. This is a company that knew exactly what it was doing and expected the legal system to protect them." The judge exhaled through his nose, eyes locked on the memo. His previous smirk was long gone. But Pam wasn't finished yet. A heavy silence stretched across the room, thick with the weight of what had just been revealed. The judge's eyes lingered on the memo, his fingers tightening around the paper, as if holding on to something he hadn't expected to confront. Charles Merritt for the first time that morning looked truly unsettled. His usual composure, the smug confidence, the effortless deflections had cracked. He cleared his throat, forcing a tight smile. Your Honor, this so-called memo is nothing more than an unverified document. Its authenticity is questionable at best. And even if it were legitimate, it does not constitute evidence of wrongdoing. We can't allow Pam didn't let him finish. Your Honor, she interjected, her tone sharp. This document was obtained directly from a former employee of the defendant's firm. Not only did they confirm its legitimacy, but they also provided email chains where executives openly discussed these fraudulent tactics. She stepped forward, handing a second file to the bailiff. Here are those emails dated time-stamped and pulled directly from internal servers. The bailiff carried the file to Judge Calloway, who skimmed the first few pages. His expression hardened. Merritt shot up from his chair. His objection. This is overruled, Judge Calloway cut in, his voice suddenly firm. He set the documents down, eyes narrowing. Mr. Merritt, do you have an actual legal argument, or are you just here to waste my time? Merritt's mouth opened, but no words came out. Pam took a slow breath, studying herself. The shift had happened, the power in the room had changed hands. She turned to the jury, her voice unwavering. For years, this company has hidden behind fine print in vague wording, knowing full well that the people signing these contracts didn't have the legal expertise to fight back. They banked on confusion, on intimidation, and most of all, on doubt. She let that word sit for a moment, watching as some of the jurors shifted in their seats. But today that doubt is gone, because now we have proof that they knew what they were doing. Proof that their intent was never honest business, but deception. She turned back to the judge, and if this court allows them to walk away from this, then we aren't just failing my clients. We're telling every corporation in America that they can do the same, and that the legal system will look the other way. A murmur ran through the jury box. A woman in the front row, who had remained expressionless for most of the hearing, pressed her lips together, nodding almost imperceptibly. Pam had them. Judge Calloway tapped his fingers on the bench again, this time slower, deliberate. Then he looked at Merritt. Do you have any response to this evidence, Mr. Merritt? Anything at all? Merritt hesitated. His usual tricks, his charm, his bluffs, his polished courtroom theatrics were useless now. Everyone could see it. The jury, the gallery, even the court reporters had stopped typing. Waiting for his response, he swallowed, adjusted his tie. Finally, he sat back down. No, Your Honor, he muttered. Judge Calloway leaned back in his chair, studying him for a moment before shifting his attention to Pam. His expression wasn't quite admiration, but it was something close. Proceed. Miss Bondi. The courtroom wasn't laughing anymore. Pam took a measured breath, studying herself as the judge's words echoed in the silent courtroom. Proceed, Miss Bondi. She had spent years in courtrooms like this, facing off against men like Charles Merritt, judges like Calloway corporations that thought their money could buy them immunity. But right now, in this moment, she wasn't just another attorney making her case. She was the only person in the room who had full control over the narrative, and she wasn't about to waste it. She turned to the jury, her gaze steady. What happens next is up to the court. But before you make up your minds, I want you to understand what's really at stake here. She gestured toward the back of the room, where several of her clients sat, ordinary people. Most of them older, some with worried expressions, others gripping their hands together tightly in their laps. She walked toward the jury box, her voice calm but firm. These are not just numbers on a spreadsheet. They are retirees who lost their life savings, parents who took second jobs just to keep their homes small, business owners who trusted a system that was designed to work against them. Pam stopped in front of the jury, lowering her voice just enough that they had to lean in to hear. The company's executives sat in boardrooms, drinking expensive coffee, deciding how far they could push people before they fought back. They counted on silence. They counted on fear. They counted on lawyers like Charles Merritt, convincing courts like this one that fraud is just business as usual. She turned, meeting Merritt's glare for the briefest second before addressing the judge again. Your Honor, the defense would have you believe this is a misunderstanding, that my clients simply didn't read the fine print. But the truth is, the fine print was written to trap them. It was a cage disguised as a contract. In the moment they signed the door, slammed shut. Pam stepped back toward the plaintiff's table, pausing just long enough for the weight of her words to settle over the room. Then she placed her hands on the table and looked directly at Judge Calloway. The only question now is whether this court is willing to let them get away with it. Silence, absolute, unshakable silence. For the first time, Calloway didn't reach for his gavel. He didn't crack another joke. He didn't smirk. He just sat there staring at the documents in front of him as if he were seeing them for the first time. The jury wasn't moving either. Some looked down at the contracts in front of them. Others glanced toward Pam's clients, their faces shifting from skepticism to something else. Anger, maybe a sense of duty. Pam exhaled quietly. She had done what she came here to do. Then Judge Calloway spoke. Mr. Merritt, he said, his voice noticeably heavier than before. After reviewing this evidence, I see no grounds for dismissal. Merritt's face stiffened. Your Honor. The judge raised a hand. No, his voice was firmer now. Your client will answer these claims in full trial. He turned to Pam. Miss Bondi, your motion to proceed is granted. Pam didn't smile, didn't gloat. She simply nodded. Thank you, Your Honor. But Charles Merritt knew. So did the jury. So did the gallery. Pam Bondi had just won the battle before the war had even begun. Judge Calloway sat back in his chair, rubbing his chin as if absorbing the weight of his own ruling. His smirk from earlier had completely vanished, replaced by something heavier, something reluctant. A judge who had walked into this hearing, expecting an open and shut case, now found himself staring at the very real possibility that he had misjudged everything. Pam Bondi remained standing, her presence unwavering. She wasn't here for approval. She wasn't here to bask in the moment. She had done what she set out to do, forced the court to take this case seriously. Charles Merritt, on the other hand, had gone pale. His fingers gripped the edges of his legal pad, knuckles white, but he knew there was nothing left to say. No more loopholes to slip through, no more legal maneuvers to bury the truth under paperwork. Judge Calloway let out a slow breath, then turned toward the court reporter. Let the record show that the defense's motion for dismissal has been denied. This case will proceed to trial. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Pam didn't react, but she felt it. The energy in the room had shifted permanently. Judge Calloway looked back at her, and for the first time there was no condescension in his expression, no smirk, no amusement, just the realization that he had underestimated her. And worse, he had let himself be played by the very people she was fighting against. He straightened his robe, cleared his throat, then spoke directly to her. Miss Bondi, he said, his voice quieter than before, you've built a compelling case here today. Pam simply nodded. That was the goal, Your Honor. He paused, then Calloway glanced at the documents one last time before looking at Charles Merritt. I strongly advise your client to reconsider their position before trial. He said, his voice carrying an edge that hadn't been there before, because based on what I've seen today, I suspect they may not like the outcome. Merritt's jaw clenched. He knew what that meant. His client might have billions, but money didn't rewrite facts, and now the court was paying attention. Pam turned to gather her files, her movements measured professional. She had no reason to celebrate, yet this was only the beginning. But as she glanced up, she caught something unexpected. The judge gave her a small nod. Not an apology, not an admission, but a nod of respect. Pam had forced a system that often favored the powerful to acknowledge that today it had met its match. Pam Bondi walked out of the courtroom with the same steady stride she had entered, with she didn't rush, didn't look back. She had done her job, and now it was up to the system to do its part. Outside, the air was thick with a chatter of reporters, eager to pounce. A few cameras flashed as journalists shoved microphones in her direction. Miss Bondi, how do you feel about today's ruling? What's your next move? Do you believe the company will settle before trial? Pam didn't slow her pace. This wasn't a moment for press conferences or sound bites. Instead, she turned to where her client stood at the courthouse steps. Men and women who had been ignored, dismissed, and taken advantage of for far too long. A woman in her 60s wearing a faded blue cardigan stepped forward hesitantly. Her voice was quiet but firm. Does this mean we have a chance? We will. Pam met her gaze and for the first time that day allowed herself a small smile. Yes, she said simply, you do. The woman pressed a hand to her mouth, her eyes glistening with relief. A few others murmured their thanks. some just nodding, too overwhelmed to speak. Pam didn't need applause. She didn't need recognition. This was why she did what she did, to give people back what had been stolen from them. Behind her, Charles Merritt emerged from the courthouse, his usual confidence replaced by something colder. He avoided her gaze, pulling out his phone as he stalked toward a black town car. Pam knew exactly what was happening. His clients were already calling, already panicking, already preparing for damage control. Good Judge Calloway's ruling didn't guarantee victory, but it sent a message: people were watching. Now the powerful weren't invincible, and no amount of legal trickery could erase the truth forever. Pam turned back to her clients. "This isn't over," she told them. "Not yet, but today you made them listen, and that's where real change starts." The woman in the cardigan nodded, gripping Pam's hand briefly before stepping back into the crowd. Pam took one last look at the courthouse, then exhaled, already thinking of the work ahead. Justice wasn't about winning one battle. It was about never letting the fight be forgotten. And that was a battle Pam Bondi had no intention of losing. If you believe that truth should always have a voice, subscribe to the channel for more stories that challenge the powerful and fight for justice. Because the only way to lose a battle is to never fight it at all.